All right, welcome. Now, I believe I did try to fix the arrangement of the mic a little better so it's not quite so plosive. All right, we were at where they were calling them mesdames. Now we have Richard. This map is really it's about the King of England, and he had a lot of territory, and at that time they called it the Angevin. And oddly, I don't believe that's even mentioned in this book. This is more about the intrigue of what this one might have said to another. Okay, so here we have Richard, in the meantime, though exposed to every insult and indignity in his German prison, did not suffer his courage to be depressed by the rigour of his confinement. Though thrown into a dungeon whence no man had ever escaped with his life, loaded with irons, and continually surrounded with armed ruffians, he preferred the serenity of his countenance and the cheerfulness of his mind. The emperor, in order to do away some part of that odium which his injustice to Richard had naturally incurred, produced him before the princes and prelates of the empire in a diet holden at Worms on the 13th day of July, and attempted a justification of his conduct by accusing that prince of various crimes and misdemeanours, of having afforded protection to Tancred, the usurper of the crown of Sicily, of having made war on the Emperor of Cyprus, a Christian prince, when his presence was requisite in Palestine, of having obstructed the progress of the Christian army by compelling the King of France, by a repetition of injuries, to retire from the Holy Land, of having affronted the Duke of Austria before the walls of Acre, of assassinating Conrad, Marquis of Montserrat, and of having concluded a... Sorry for that pause. But yeah, Conrad was Marquis of Montserrat, I suppose. And of having concluded a truce with Saladin on disadvantageous terms, and leaving Jerusalem in the hands of the Saracens. Richard, far from sinking beneath the weight of Salem in the hands... Does it really say? No, not Salem. Oh, odd. Yeah, Jerusalem, and then they ended up calling it Salem over in the witch trials. Anyway, so we're having it here, disadvantageous terms, and leaving Jerusalem in the hands of the Saracens. Richard, far from sinking beneath the weight of his misfortunes, proceeded with firmness and precision to answer these calumnious and ill-grounded accusations, after premising that he was exempted by his dignity from submitting to any jurisdiction except that of heaven. The eloquence and spirit of his defence made so strong an impression on the German princes, that they loudly censured the conduct of the emperor. The Pope, too, threatened him with excommunication, and Henry, who had been induced to listen to the base proposals of Philip and Prince John, now found that it would be impossible to favour the accomplishment of their treacherous designs by a longer detention of the King of England. He therefore agreed to accept 150,000 marks of silver for his ransom, 100,000 marks of which were to be paid before he received his liberty, and 67 hostages delivered for the remainder. There's hostages also. The emperor, too, to gloss over the infamy of this transaction, presented to Richard at the same time the kingdom of Arles, comprehending, among other provinces, Provence, Dauphiné, and Narbonne, over which the empire had some antiquated claims. But this present present the King of England very wisely neglected. I wonder why they're saying present there, but they did. Anyway, 1194. When the requisite sum was collected, Queen Eleonora and the Archbishop of Rouen set out with it for Germany a few days before Christmas, paid the money to the Emperor and the Duke of Austria at Mentz, delivered them hostages for the remainder, and freed Richard from captivity on the 4th of February. So now Richard, King of England, is free. His escape was very critical. Henry had been detected in the assassination of the Bishop of Liège, and in an attempt of a similar nature on the Duke of Louvain, and these flagitious practices having rendered him obnoxious to the princes of the empire, he had determined to secure himself from the effects of their hatred by entering into an alliance with the King of France, to detain Richard, the enemy of Philip, in perpetual confinement, and to gratify his own avarice by keeping the money which he had already received for his ransom, and by the extortions of the fresh sums from Philip and Prince John, who had made him an offer of 150,000 marks of silver, on condition that he would keep his royal captive only 1 year longer. For this purpose he issued orders to pursue the arrest of Richard, but that prince, suspecting his intentions, had travelled with the utmost expedition, so that when the emperor's messengers arrived at Antwerp, he had already embarked at the mouth of the Shield, and was out of sight of land. As soon as Philip heard of Richard's deliverance from captivity, he wrote to his confederate John and expressed himself thus: "Take care of yourself, for the devil is unchained." The conduct of the King of England showed the necessity of this caution, for after he had regulated his domestic affairs, resumed all the exorbitant grants which he had been necessitated to make before his departure for the Holy Land, and taken possession of all Prince John's estates in England, which had been confiscated in a great council of the barons. He prepared to exact a severe vengeance for the perfidy of Philip. That monarch, apprised of his designs, immediately commenced hostilities, and had already invested Verneuil. When he was alarmed with the intelligence of John, and had reconciled himself to his brother, massacred the French garrisons in Évreux, and delivered it into the hands of the King of England, and that Richard himself, with a formidable force, had landed at Barfleur, and was rapidly advancing to the relief of, here we are, Verneuil. Relief of Verneuil. Philip, with a band of chosen troops, repaired secretly by a forced march into Evreux, which he retook by surprise, massacred not only the English garrison, but the native inhabitants, whose habitations and whose churches he reduced to ashes. But this exaction of indiscriminate vengeance was productive of little advantage. On his return, he found that the troops he had left at Verneuil had, on the news of Richard's approach, disbanded in confusion, and he himself narrowly escaped the pursuit of his rival. The spirit of animosity and revenge, which equally prevailed, though from indifferent causes, in the breasts of the hostile monarchs, urged them to increase the horrors of war by needless devastations and unprofitable cruelty. After reducing the castle of Lochy, the King of England advanced to give battle to Philip. The two armies met in the vicinity of Fréteval, between Château-d'Un and Vendôme. But Philip was still desirous of avoiding a decisive battle, and concealed his intentions of a retreat by sending a defiance to Richard, importing that the next morning he might expect his attack. That was in quotes. But his rival was not so easily deceived. Yeah, he could not deceive his rival on that one. Okay, now we're at. He returned a speedy and resolute answer, which was no sooner delivered than the French were surprised by the approach of the English army. The charge was sudden and impetuous. The troops of France were speedily dispersed by the active and intrepid valour of the lion-hearted Richard. A first mention of it. Yes, he is Richard the Lion-hearted. And Philip was disgraced by an ignominious flight. His baggage and his military chests were taken, together with his cartulary and records, which commonly at that time attended his person. These last, which Richard would never consent to restore, were imperfectly supplied by the memory of his ministers and the industry of Gautier, whom he employed to replace them. In 1195, Philip sought to repair his late misfortune by a sudden invasion of Normandy, but Richard, ever active and vigilant, was prepared to meet him in all quarters. Near Vaudreuil, the hostile armies came in sight of each other, when Philip proposed a negotiation, which he artfully prolonged, to give his troops an opportunity of undermining the walls of that fortress. The King of England did not discover his treachery till he was surprised, during a conference with his rival, by a dreaded noise, occasioned by the fall of a considerable part of the castle. Inflamed with resentment, he hastened to collect his troops, that he might inflict a just chastisement on his perfidious foe. But the French army, having made previous preparations for their retreat, fled with such precipitation that his utmost efforts to overtake them proved fruitless. The war was carried on for some months after this transaction with various success, but without producing any general action or important event, and was at length terminated by a treaty of peace, concluded between the two kings in a personal interview on the 5th of December. In 1196 through 1197, but the voice of humanity was again silenced by the clamours of resentment, and in less than 6 months the peace was broken, and the destructive flames of war again raged with unabated violence. Richard strengthened himself by an alliance with the Counts of Flanders, Toulouse, Boulogne, Champagne, and other considerable vassals of the crown of France. But he soon experienced the insincerity of those princes, and the inability of his efforts to make an impression on a kingdom governed by a monarch so vigorous and active as Philip. This war, like the last, was distinguished only by the capture of a few insignificant towns and fortresses, by the devastation of the open country, and by acts of unheard-of cruelty. The Bishop of Beauvais, a martial prelate of the family of Dreux, and cousin german to the king, being taken in battle, Richard, who hated him for having been the means of increasing the rigour of his confinement in Germany, threw him into prison and loaded him with irons. And when the Pope demanded his liberty and claimed him as his son, the English monarch sent to His Holiness the coat of mail which the prelate had worn in battle, and which was all besmeared with blood, accompanied by the words which the sons of Jacob employed to their father: "This we have found, know whether it be thy son's coat or not." In 1198, the interposition of a legate from the Pope at length induced the rival monarchs to consent to a truce for 5 years, after the conclusion of which the Pope again exerted his mediatory powers in order to effect a lasting peace, that the two kings might be enabled to undertake a second expedition to Palestine. But before this salutary purpose could be accomplished, an event occurred that put an end to the negotiation. A considerable treasure, consisting of ancient coins and medals, had been found in the lands of Vidomar. Viscount of Limoges, a vassal of the King of England, who claimed it as a treasure trove which, when found in the earth, became the property of the superior lord. His claim being rejected, he prepared to enforce it by an attack on the castle of Chaillot, near Limoges, where the treasure was supposed to be concealed. But during the siege of that fortress, he received a wound from an arrow, which being unskillfully treated, the arrow was unskillfully, oh no, he was unskillfully treated. Oh no, this is terrible. Put an end to his existence. Okay, so from the wound from the arrow being unskillfully treated, I believe he was not treated well after the wound. Not the arrow's point. It wasn't that. 1199 and 1200 AG. On the death of Richard, we are really talking Richard the Lion-Hearted now. His brother John succeeded to the throne of England, though Arthur, Duke of Brittany, was therefore defeated by his claim, as by right of representation he stood in the place of his father Geoffrey, John's eldest brother. But the doctrine of representation appears at this time to have made a greater progress on the continent than in England. All the prelates and barons of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine supported the pretensions of Arthur, but was now only in his 13th year. He's only 13 years old as a king, acknowledged him as their liege lord, and by an act of their assembly established him in the possession of the government. The young prince was placed by his mother Constance under the protection of Philip, to whom he did homage for all the continental dominations of his deceased uncle. And Philip, who's governed, Philip, sorry, I'll have to follow that one completely, whose enmity, yes, and Philip, whose enmity, big difference, to the English was uniformly inveterate. By whatever monarch they were governed, willingly embraced his cause in the hope of embarrassing John and dismembering his dominions. That monarch made an eruption into Normandy, reduced into the territory of Evreux, and advanced as far as Mons, where he met the Duchess of Brittany and her son Arthur. From hence he hastened to Tours, but his progress was stopped by the approach of John, who invested the capital of Maine, and after taking it, razed the fortifications and demolished the walls of the city. This war, however, proved of short duration. The two monarchs met between Vernon and Andélé, and the terms proposed by the English prince appeared so advantageous to Philip that he accepted them without hesitation. To Louis, the eldest son of Philip, John offered his niece Blanche of Castile, and with her the baronies of Issoudun and Grasset, and other fiefs in Berry. And to Philip himself he ceded the Vexin Normand, 9 barons of the King of France and as many of the King of England were guarantees of this treaty, and all of them swore that if their sovereign violated any article of it, they would declare themselves against him and embrace the cause of the injured monarch. One principal inducement with Philip to the conclusion of a peace with John was the conduct of Constance, mother to Arthur, who, jealous of his power and designs, had carried her son secretly off from Paris, put him into the hands of his uncle, restored the provinces which had adhered to the young prince, and made him do homage for the duchy of Brittany, which was a rare fief of Normandy. Okay. The marriage of Prince Louis with Blanche of Castile was celebrated in Normandy because the interdict imposed on the Kingdom of France on account of the king's separation from Engelberga was still in force. So there was a separation now from Engelberga. The reconciliation between the rival monarchs bore every mark of sincerity on both sides. John paid a visit to Philip at Paris, and during his residence at the French court he was treated with all the honours due his rank, and at his departure was loaded with presents. But this pleasing prospect speedily disappeared, and the incontinence of John, the ambition of Philip, and the discontent of young Arthur occasioned a new rupture. The King of England, during a progress he made into Guyenne, for the purpose of receiving the homage of the barons of that province, became enamoured of Isabella, the beautiful heiress of Aymar. I might have to take a break soon. I don't think I'm reading very well right now. But yeah, the beautiful heiress of Aymar Taillefer, Count of Angoulême. His queen, with whom he had received the earldom of Gloucester and many other extensive possessions, was still alive, and Isabella was married to Hugh Le Brun, Count of La Marche, and already consigned to his care. Although, by reason of her tender years, the marriage had not been consummated. These obstacles, however, to a prince of John's disposition appeared trivial. He found means to persuade the Count of Angoulême to decoy his daughter from her husband, and, having on some frivolous pretence or other procured a divorce from his own consort, he was married to Isabella by the Archbishop of Bordeaux. This marriage, not less imprudent than criminal, created him many enemies, and excited the resentment of the injured husband, who soon found an opportunity to punish his powerful and insolent rival. The Count of La Marche and his brother, the Count of Eu, excited commotions in Poitou and Normandy, when John marched against them and took from the latter the fortress of Driancourt, now called Dancourt. The two counts then applied to Philip for protection and demanded justice on his vassal, an application which was favourably received by the court of France, which was eager to embrace any opportunity for humbling its rival. In 1201 and 1202, at a conference between the two monarchs, Philip, conscious of his superiority, reprimanded John in a tone of severity that, by intimidating, induced him to promise whatever was required of him. He even engaged to go to Paris in order to do homage for Poitou, Anjou, and Aquitaine, and to appear before the peers of France to answer to the various charges that were exhibited against him by the barons. He likewise promised to surrender to Philip the fortresses of Tillers and Boutevant, as a likewise promised to surrender to Philip. No, I'm sorry. God dang it, I lost it. Boutevant as a security for performance. But all these engagements he violated. The king then determined to commence hostilities, and the war, which was now begun, continued with little interruption for the long space of 56 years. So there was a war that has begun without it really any interruption for 56 years. The two fortresses which ought to have been surrendered were successfully attacked, and with Lyon, Aquile, Mortemer, and Gournay submitted to the victorious arms of France. In the meantime, Constance, Duchess of Brittany, having died at Nantes, her son Arthur repaired to Rennes, took possession of the duchy, and received the homage of the nobility. The young prince, who was now rising to man's estate, being animated with a just resentment against his uncle, who had not only deprived him of his lawful succession, but, if some contemporary writers may be credited, had already formed designs against his life, supported the complaints of the barons of Guyenne, and demanded justice of Philip with regard to his own pretensions to that fief, as well as to those of Normandy and Anjou. The King of France, incensed at the little regard that had been hitherto paid to his remonstrances, resolved to push John to extremities. He invested Arthur with the treaties of Poitou, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, and gave him troops to enable him to reduce them. But that young prince, without waiting for the reinforcements, which were hastening to join him from Brittany, Berry, and Burgundy, invested the castle of Mirabeau in Poitou, where his grandmother Eleonora, who had warmly espoused the cause of John, resided, under the protection of the weak garrison. The siege was pressed with so much vigour that the queen was compelled to retire into one of the towers, and to surrender the rest of the fortress to the victor. John, having received advice of his mother's situation, flew to her relief with an army of English and Brabazons. He attacked Arthur's camp by surprise, and by superiority of numbers obtained a decisive victory, every man in the army of that prince being either killed or taken prisoner. Among the captives were Arthur himself, the Count de la Marche, Geoffrey de Lusignan, and the most considerable of the revolted barons, who were all loaded with irons. and confined in different prisons in Normandy and England. The unfortunate Duke of Brittany was sent to Falaise, and from thence to Rouen, where he suddenly disappeared. Though historians have differed in their accounts of the manner in which his death was effected, they all agree in ascribing it to the machinations, if not to the hand of John, whose throne was by the infamous deed shaken to its very foundation. The Bretons, enraged at the murder of their prince, determined to revenge his death, and when John, in consequence of it, had the insolence to demand the administration of Brittany as guardian of Eleonora, Arthur's sister, whom he had seized and carried to England, they received his proposal with horror. The states of the duchy immediately assembled to fix the succession of their government and choose for their sovereign Alice, a young daughter of Constance, by her second husband, Guy de Thouars, and they appointed that nobleman to be her guardian, and to govern the duchy during her minority. Finding all their solicitations for the release of Eleonora treated with neglect, they proceeded to draw up articles of impeachment against John, which they presented to Philip as Lord Paramount of all that monarch's continental of all that monarch's continental territories. The king received this application with pleasure, and accordingly summoned John to appear and answer. He had to answer to the charges, and on his non-appearance passed a sentence, with the unanimous concurrence of the peers, couched in the following terms, in quotes, "Whereas John, Duke of Normandy, forgetting his oath to King Philip, his lord, has murdered the son of his elder brother, who was an homager of the King of France, and the king's kinsman, and perpetuated the crime within the seigneury of France. He is found guilty of felony and treason, and adjudged to forfeit all the territories which he holds by homage." In 1203, Philip now prepared to execute his sentence by force of arms, and having no longer found the policy of Henry, nor the martial and active disposition of Richard to contend with, adopted the resolution of expelling the English from all those valuable fiefs which had been so long dismembered from his crown. For this purpose he assembled a powerful army, and directing his march towards Anjou, he was joined by almost all the barons of that province, as well as by those of Poitou, all the great vassals of the crown, whose jealousy might have urged them to obstruct his progress, were either inclined to assist him from disgust to John, or were not in a situation to oppose him. The Counts of Flanders and Boulogne were engaged in the Crusades, and the Count of Champagne was an infant, and under the guardianship of Philip. The states of Brittany seconded all of his measures with vigour, and the general defection of John's vassals rendered every enterprise that was undertaken against him easy and successful. In less than 6 months, either by force or stratagem, Philip obtained possession of most of the towns in Upper Normandy. The rapidity of his victorious progress was unexampled in the martial achievements of an age in which the art of war was by little understood. Nonancourt and Conches opened their gates at his approach. Andely was compelled to capitulate. Radepont was taken by assault, and Vadedril, Pont-à-l'Arche, and Montfort surrendered after a trifling resistance. Chateau Gaillard, a castle erected by Richard on the brink of a precipice on the banks of Seine, near Andely, and supposed to be impregnable, was also reduced after an obstinate defense of 6 months. So they fought one castle for 6 months. It looks like right now the English are losing France. So I'll leave it right there. We'll stick with John. John has become interesting in this situation. We'll keep going. I don't know. I keep thinking my voice is so terrible. All right, John, during these transactions, remained at Caen in a state of inactivity that astonished his enemies and dispirited his friends. When apprised of the progress of the French arms, "Let them proceed," he said. "I will retake more places in a day than they will have reduced in a year." But previous to the reduction of Chateau Gaillard, he made a feeble and successless effort for its relief, then hastening to London, left Philip to complete the conquest of Normandy at his leisure. The king did not suffer so fair an opportunity to escape. After a siege of 7 days, Falaise submitted to his arms. Domfront, Caen, Coutances, Bayeux, Lizeau, and Avranches opened their gates to the conqueror. Rouen, Arques, and Verneuil were the only places that now remained. Of all the rich and extensive duchy under the domination of the English, these towns, I'm belching, this is awful tonight. These towns were indeed strongly fortified and supplied with numerous garrisons. But at the approach of Philip, they all engaged to surrender, if not relieved, before the expiration of 30 days. So it looks like it's all gone, isn't it? The English are backing out. We have a few cities here left, Rouen, Arques, and Verneuil. They were the only places remaining under domination of the English. And even then, I imagine they're going to go sooner than lightning bolt. This is the year 1206, and I'm on page 411. Yay. Thank you for listening.